President John Kennedy once referenced what he called an ancient Chinese curse in a speech delivered in 1966. I don't know where his speechwriters came up with some of these things. John Kennedy's speeches were often full of historical references that were completely made up on the spot. But they said this ancient Chinese curse was something that they used against their enemies, saying, "May you live in interesting times." It's not Chinese and it's not ancient, but ironically, it does feel kind of true, doesn't it? Cursed or not, we're living in very interesting times. Hot wars in Ukraine and Palestine, an almost inevitable invasion of Taiwan by China, a horrifying presidential election which, no hyperbole here, could end democracy, could end free elections as fascism seems to be gaining an ever stronger footing in the Republican Party. We also have technological advances coming at us faster than we can comprehend, and artificial intelligence, renewable energy that's going to make self-driving cars the way we're going to get around in the near future. They all hold promise of life enhancement and threats, both economically and physically. We didn't choose to be born into such a volatile world. But folks, here we are. We are living in a time when moral leadership may be needed more than ever, and yet the institutions that have inculcated, trained, brought people up to provide moral leadership are at some of the weakest points they've ever been at. And I'm talking about churches and institutions of learning. As former Attorney General Eric Holder recently very prophetically said, there is no cavalry coming. There's no miracle solution, no saviors. In the end, we, the American people, and not any of our formerly trustworthy institutions, are going to save us. We have to save our democracy by voting in defense of that democracy this fall. We are the cavalry. The responsibility is ours. In these interesting times, institutions we once trusted seem now to be compromised beyond redemption. One need only pay attention to the past 2 years of the evolution of the Supreme Court into a partisan dumpster fire to realize that there simply is no reliable cavalry that's going to ride over the hill to save democracy. The Supreme Court has, in my opinion, sacrificed their moral credibility in service to a moronic Clementine Caligula. And what are they getting in exchange? They are enthroning 16th century Roman Catholic misogyny into law. It is unbelievable that this is happening. It's difficult to believe that the highest court in the world's oldest democracy could have fallen into such corruption, such incompetence, and freedom-hating ideology. But that's what we're seeing. But when you elect someone like Donald Trump as president, you can't expect him to appoint the world's greatest legal minds to the bench. I like the Turkish proverb that says, when a clown moves into a palace, the clown doesn't become a king, the palace becomes a circus. In 2016, we put a lying, misogynist, con artist clown into the White House. And now, even though he's been gone for over 3 years, our justice system and our legislative branch are still reeling from the circus he created. He can still make phone calls and kill legislation and we still see the Trump-appointed jurists on the Supreme Court bending the knee to him in embarrassing loyalty. I shudder to think how much more damage he could do if voters screw up this fall and give Trump another bite of the apple. Thankfully, he was out of office when Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago, because now the world is standing on the precipice of a nuclear war, more so perhaps than even the early Cold War days when I and my elementary school classmates were taught to hide under our desks to protect us from a nuclear bomb. Most of us initially feared that Ukraine would fall to the Russian armies in a matter of weeks, if not, for that matter, days. But their fierce and courageous defense of their homeland has, over the passage of time, provoked the expansion of the membership of NATO and made most Western nations willing, dangerously, to keep pressuring Russia out of Ukraine, even though doing so increases the chances that Putin, feeling trapped, might use nuclear weapons. You may remember that when the war began over 2 years ago, we refused to give aircraft or long-range missiles because we didn't want to escalate the war. We didn't want Putin to feel like we were giving Ukraine the capability to attack Russia. Putin even mentioned in those early months that Russia has no use for a world if Russia doesn't still exist. So he was hinting at his willingness to use nuclear weapons if it came down to it. But as repeated Russian war crimes and the huge death tolls among Ukrainian civilians has emboldened the United States and NATO to continue to step up our support of Ukraine, we have been willing increasingly to accept the increased risk of what a desperate Vladimir Putin just might do when he feels trapped. The media, which can rarely walk and chew gum at the same time, was focused on Ukraine until suddenly Hamas launched a terrorist attack against Israel, and they just about forgot that there was still a war in Ukraine. This attack that included the most barbaric elements of rape, torture, and murder of babies caught the conservative government of Israel off guard. The failure of Netanyahu's government has caused him to try to look like he's in charge, that he's bold, that he's brave and decisive, by responding to Hamas in what looks to most of us in the rest of the world like a genocidal war against the inhabitants of the Gaza Strip. 6 months later, this shocking attack on a civilian population has provoked outrage around the world, seen most recently boiling over on campuses of American universities. What I wish I could say to those students is that two things can be true at once, especially in such complicated times as these. I'm glad that university students are now increasingly aware of world events, and they are willing to take drastic measures to express their views. I am sorry, however, that they seem to be so opposed to Netanyahu's tactics that they have forgotten what Hamas did to start this conflict, and they are allowing anti-Semitic fringe elements to shape their protests in a way that is now threatening the safety of Jewish students on their own campuses, many of whom, if not most, actually sympathize with their protests against Netanyahu's excesses. You can support Israel and not support Netanyahu. Most of us do, including President Biden. You can advocate for Palestinians without threatening to start another genocide against the Jews. Students across America have been heard to repeat That old Palestinian anti-Semitic chant, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," without any sincere understanding of what that chant really means. Look, there is no way to polish this turd. Look at the map. This is the Jordan River, and this is the Mediterranean Sea, the east and west boundaries of Israel. This chant is an anti-Semitic threat from Palestine that they want to literally push the Jews into the sea. Attempts at insisting that it does not mean what it clearly does mean shouldn't fool anyone. I am a reluctant supporter of Israel. The theft of Palestinian territory to create a Jewish homeland at the end of World War II was stupid, it was illegal, and it was based on little more than British and American Sunday school geopolitics that wanted to give the Jews the Holy Land as they romantically imagined that God had given it to them 3,000 years ago. I'll tell you personally, what started out as a casual conversation in a local coffee shop got heated when an older man and I were discussing this situation, and he insisted to me that the Jews owned the land because God gave it to them. Now having to check off another coffee shop in Vero Beach where I am no longer welcome, I pointed out that there is no great wonder that the Jews wrote a book in which they claimed that God gave them the land. But that would hardly stand up as a real estate claim in a title lawsuit, especially since the Muslims have written a book that says that God gave the land to them. Honestly, the book of Exodus describes God as being a violent, pathological land thief. I don't know how anyone in the 21st century could take that absurd claim seriously. However, I could take you to a nearby coffee shop and introduce you to some people who are willing to defend it in very stark terms. I, however, will have to wait in the car. I hate to have to go back a full century to find a member of the Supreme Court that I'm willing to quote in a sermon, but I want to tip my hat to Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, "I would not give a fig for the simplicity this side of complexity, but I will give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity." We're all offended. We're all horrified by both the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. But getting out of it is not a simple matter. I realize that the news in these interesting times is draining, it's stressful, and admittedly, it is tiresome because it's so complicated. I'm afraid that many of our college students are taking a far too simplistic view of the Palestinian crisis. But you can't really fault them when members of the Republican-led House are daily repeating Russian propaganda, endangering the world and destroying American credibility. I expect more of our university students. But honestly, folks, I'm at a loss for words as to what to say about how ignorant, un-American, and dangerously misinformed these Republican members of Congress are. Some have even repeated on the floor of the Congress Russian misinformation, like insisting that President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine was using our aid money to enrich himself. One even showed pictures of two yachts that they claim belonged to Volodymyr Zelensky. This is obvious Russian slander. But who would have ever believed that the people who are holding elected seats in Congress could be dumb enough to believe it? I think some of these people are missing some important briefings. As many of you surely know by now, I've not been a great fan of President Joe Biden, but when it comes to managing foreign affairs, we have a lot of reasons to stand up and applaud his steady hand on the wheel in the midst of complicated events to which there are no easy answers, and all the simple answers that have been put forward from all sides are, if you take time to look at it, are more dangerous than these more measured approaches that the Biden administration has taken. Everyone in the world, save only a small group of radicals in Israel, is mad about how the response to the Hamas terror attack in October has been handled. But I just have not heard many people offer a workable solution to removing Hamas from power in Palestine. And if you believe that Hamas should be allowed to continue to exist in Gaza, then I submit that you have not studied the events closely enough. They're still holding hostages. How can you call for a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, when they won't even give up their hostages? Longtime listeners will recall, I hope, the many times that I have said that I am so opposed to warfare that I'm already against the next war. Honestly, that has not been much of an overstatement. I almost always think there's a better solution than anything from the military. We never should have invaded Afghanistan. There were better ways to respond to the 9/11 attack on the United States. We had little to no reason to invade Iraq. And in fact, by invading Iraq, we took away the one local power that held Iran's military in check, which has allowed them to become a regional exporter of terrorism and possibly a nuclear threat. The war in Iraq was ignorant and dangerous on every meaningful level. One of my professors at Harvard was fond of saying that if all you have is a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. The United States has been so invested in military power that we have often acted like all we had was a hammer. And I have advocated for more than 40 years that we invest more in diplomacy and less in military might. I'm not a pacifist, but I've always kind of wanted to be one. Still, I often look at military action in much the same way that I look at a parent spanking a child. Many parents will insist that spanking is the only thing that works on their kids, but I tend to think that use of violence against children is not parenting, it's evidence of having failed as a parent. If beating your kids is how you hope to teach them good behavior, I think you've already missed the point. War is almost always a sign of a failure of or a gross neglect of diplomacy. There were 1,000 things that Israel should have been doing to improve the circumstances in the Gaza Strip and the livelihood of Palestinians before that October terrorist attack. But once Hamas had done what they did, a military response became necessary. I think that the West has been disingenuous about the security of Ukraine, and that we had sent a lot of the wrong signals to Russia about our intentions in NATO. But once Russian armies poured over the border into Ukraine, diplomacy was no longer an option, and a military response has become absolutely necessary. I hate it, but without a time machine, we don't have any other options. Hamas can only do what they do because of funding and supplies from Iran. Iran would love to attack the United States, would love to attack Israel directly, but for both historical and ideological reasons, they can't give up their desire, but they know they couldn't win the war. So they use proxies, of which Hamas is only one. The United States now finds itself engaged in 2 undeclared wars. It may sound horrible to say it, but we are using Israel as a proxy to fight Iran, and we are using Ukraine as a proxy to fight Russia. The world cannot afford for us to ignore the danger posed by both Iran and Russia, and selfishly, I'm glad that we have found ways to do it without having to deploy American troops, even though we must not look lightly on the sacrifices made by combatants made on both sides of these wars. Most of the people engaged in all of these conflicts are not the perpetrators of the conflicts. They are all victims. I was in Thailand last winter, and there the beaches were full of draft-age Russian young men who were avoiding being sent to Ukraine. I'm glad they were avoiding it. They were largely drunk and obnoxious on the beaches in Thailand, but still, many Russians who have died in that war were sent into battle totally unprepared. Many even are prisoners. Putin has emptied the prisons of Russia, sending prisoners ill-equipped, untrained, and sometimes even unarmed to smoke out the positions of the Ukrainian forces to deplete their ammunition. Putin is heartless, even though people like Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene keeps insisting that Putin is not that bad. I don't know how many listeners that I have in Georgia, but I beg you to do whatever you can do to get this woman out of office. There was a horrifying block of aid by Moscow Marge and other Republican right-wingers in the Congress until mid-April. House Speaker Mike Johnson, who had previously voted against aid to Ukraine and was preventing any future aid from ever being voted on until Ukraine was nearly entirely out of ammunition and was having to draw up plans for retreat. Somehow, Mike Johnson experienced an overnight conversion. I'll side with MSNBC News host Joe Scarborough, who says of deathbed conversions, "I'll take it." Johnson was playing a very dangerous political game with much-needed aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. I've been horrified by his willingness to put world stability at risk so that a few Republican right-wingers could feel like they were owning the libs. But it looks like some rational thought somehow penetrated Johnson's lust for power. A lot of damage has been done to our reputation globally, and the coalition of Western nations that has been supporting the Ukraine was in danger of falling apart without us. But as I said, better late than never. So I'll take it, and I'm glad that Johnson had a conversion experience and that we have now voted aid to help Ukraine win this war. We've been concerned that if Russia is successful in annexing Ukraine, that Putin wouldn't stop there. But I think that the longer we keep Ukraine supplied to stay in the fight, the less able Russia will be able to invade anything short of a vacant shopping mall. May I remind you that we won the Cold War not by deploying troops and fighting, but by building up our military resources in a way that provoked the Soviet Union to do the same thing until they simply ran out of resources. Our credit line was better. So the Soviet Union fell apart without our ever firing a shot because they were trying to outspend us in building up their military forces. In the same way, Putin thought he would take Ukraine quickly. He was not supplied for a sustained war, and the more he runs his assets down, the less capable he will be to threaten Poland or other former Soviet states. Bloomberg estimates that Russia has spent more than half of its capital on this war in the past 2 years, and that possibly half of their armored vehicles have been destroyed. What is more, the BBC estimates that more than 50,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in this war. Uncounted thousands have been seriously injured. These losses come straight out of the demographic sector, those 20 and 30-year-old Russians who would have shaped Russia's future. Their future scientists, inventors, business leaders, and government officials, are now buried in unmarked graves in Ukraine. I hate this for the Russian people, but we have to acknowledge that by draining their resources, the world will be safer if this war leaves Russia incapable of menacing its neighbors in the next generation. Think of the roles played by Germany and Japan in the lead up to World War II, and look what happened when those devastated nations moved past their era of war madness and started to build a technological and advanced society rooted in education and commerce. Less than a century ago, Germany, Japan, Italy were our Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Could you imagine a world just 10 years from now in which Russia, Iran, maybe North Korea could become some of our best friends and most reliable trading partners? Is it too much to hope for? Please don't become jaded by the current state of affairs. We have been in darker places in modern history, and I believe that with the right heart, with the right moral vision, a new and better world is waiting to be born. But remember this time, you are the cavalry that has to make it happen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.